Hello, welcome to Zoonosis with Joy. I'm Joy, and today we're going to be talking about Kush, we're going to be talking about black pharaohs, we're going to be talking about Dongola horses, as well as equine trypanosoma. I hope you like this one. So, when we think about the Bronze Age, we think about horses. We think about horses and we think about chariots. So, Ramesses II and his famous war chariots crushing cities. We think about the Assyrians making mountains of skulls and riding their chariots around. We think about the Iliad and Homer and these classical depictions of chariots. And they were quite often used in this context. They were mobile missile platforms where you could rain stones and javelins and arrows down on the enemy and then ride away swiftly. One thing that many of us, including myself, didn't realize until relatively recently is that these horses and these chariots, one of the places that they came from wasn't Anatolia or Greece or Israel or Sumer or Egypt, but actually was Kush, what was called Nubia and is today called Sudan. These horses play a huge role in history, and it's actually kind of interesting that if you could track it and follow the threads through. Some of the first mentions that we get of these horses actually come from the 25th dynasty of Egypt, the famous Black Pharaoh dynasty. You know, of course, when we think about ethnicities in ancient Egypt, there's quite a bit of controversy. Egypt's kind of a crossroads of civilization, so to speak. I mean, you've got people coming from the Near East, from Africa, from across the Mediterranean, all over the place. But in this period specifically, we have King Pi from the Kushite kingdom who invaded northwards and actually conquered Egypt and established an Egyptian dynasty there. During his conquest, we actually get some recorded documentary evidence from the Kushites themselves talking about this victory. And one of the things that outraged them, severely got them really mad, was the fact that when they invaded the city of Hermopolis, they found that the Egyptians had left the horses to starve in the stables. And this was considered an outrageous barbarity by the conquerors, and they used that as part of their imperial propaganda on the victory stele. I'll post a picture of part of that stele and then the full thing as well, so that you can look at that. But it tells you a lot about this long and complex history that we have in this region. Moving forwards from the 8th century to the 7th century, there was the Neo-Assyrian Empire, right? This is the big empire that sweeps across the Bronze Age world and basically seizes control of the area. They actually were sourcing their horses from this area of Kush, and this is also where they got some of their famous charioteers. The Assyrians were quite famous for their use of cavalry and the use of horses, and it's very interesting to think about that. Based on their own documentary evidence, they were actually getting horses from this region of the world. Moving forwards in history, you know, we think about the Mamluks of Egypt, the famous slave soldiers that rode on cavalry horses. A lot of their horses came from upwards of the Nile, and we could think that these famous horses that have come to be known as the Dongola horses, one of the local breeds of horses in Sudan, that they actually were that the Mamluk slave soldiers were riding these horses as well. As slavery, of course, ravaged the continent on the trans-Saharan and the transatlantic slave trade, these horses commanded huge prices. When human beings were used as money, these horses could command prices of 5, even 10 slaves. So these horses were extremely valuable, and you know, when the Europeans started coming into the region, they recognized this. They quite remarked and they quite admired the horses of Kush, of Sudan, of Nubia. When the British established the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, they conquered the region basically, and also, you know, diplomatic finagling they colonized the region basically. Starting in 1898, one of the things that they wanted to do was improve the genetic stock of the horses there. And they did this, of course, by importing the inbred thoroughbred lines. So they brought in these big thoroughbred horses. They really admired the Dongola breed of horse because it was quite tall and slender, it had these long limbs. And I think this is probably one of the reasons why these horses were so prized. They had very long limbs, which creates more of a lever arm. It means that they can run faster. This means they can pull a chariot or move quite quickly as cavalry as well. And the British recognized this, and they wanted to, of course, introduce and cross those genetics to make new horses and make new racehorses. Of course, the British, being the British, introduced their sports of polo as well as horse racing. These sports have become something of a constant in Sudanese culture. I found a few articles online discussing it, and I obviously am no expert, so take what I'm saying with a grain of salt, but sports like polo and horse racing have become quite popular in places like Darfur. These horses, of course, this is obviously, horses is more of an elite sort of thing, right? It's very difficult and expensive to keep a horse, let alone train it or get riding lessons and veterinary care and all that. But even into the 20th century and even after Sharia law banned horse betting, horse racing remained. And this isn't just a thing that men do. Obviously, this is horses have very traditionally been a masculine kind of hobby for a lot of people, but also women living in Sudan, and that's quite interesting, I think, as well. In one of my previous videos, I talked about horses in tropical regions, so places we think typically, like Southeast Asia, Central America, the neotropics is what we call them sometimes, as well as Central Africa. Most regions of Africa don't have a lot of horses because of one of the big factors being the equine trypanosoma. Now, I talked about it at length in the previous video, so definitely check that out if you haven't. But for what that is, it's a parasite that lives in the tsetse. The tsetse is a type of biting fly, kind of similar to our horse flies, right? They will go around to horses and other animals, and they basically will bite and macerate this soft tissue and that sort of thing. The parasites will invade, and they cause a number of things: fever, anemia, cachexia, which is like wasting of the muscles and the fat, eventually death. In some regions of Sudan, like South Darfur, the seroprevalence is upwards of 20%, up to 20% or so. But in some regions of Sudan, it's less than 5%, approaching 1 to 2%. So there's not a lot of prevalence in some parts of Sudan, but definitely in some parts there's a huge disease burden. That hasn't stopped them from becoming a major horse region. Sudan ranked back in 2005, so there's not a lot of up-to-date statistics about this kind of thing. 25th in the world for horse population. That puts it right alongside other African countries that have large numbers of horses. We think Ethiopia, Mali, South Africa. Not as high as places like Canada, United States, European countries, but pretty significant, pretty high up on the list in terms of countries. There's 150-ish countries in the world. I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, but that means that despite the so-called ecological barriers that are posed by this parasite and by the fact that we're in the continent of Africa where there are wild equids like zebras, there still is a huge horse culture that has existed for thousands of years, that still exists despite the political upsets. You had the colonization, you had the imposition of Sharia law after colonization, there was the Civil War, there was the breaking off of South Sudan, there was the ousting of President Omar al-Bashir. This long history of turmoil, and it's hard to get a good sense from as an outsider what's going on, but the horse culture persists, and this long history from the Black Pharaohs to the Assyrians to the Mamluks to now, it's a great historical continuity and shows that we can't necessarily use a geographical kind of determinist thing to give us to let us know and inform us exactly what's going to happen. History plays a huge role, and the horses themselves, the desirable features of them, their long legs, their large bodies, these things can overrule even the biggest ecological barriers. So there's multiple factors that go into these things. It's quite complex. There's not going to be one causal factor that explains everything, nor should there be. The world is complicated. But that's kind of what I had to share about that. So I've talked long enough. There's still 2 weeks until the horse course gets up and running. So if you're interested in learning more about this kind of thing, definitely check it out. It's going to be 6 sessions, 2 hours per session. There are some readings involved, so if you like reading and learning about horses, hey, I got the course for you. If not, there's also the archives of the Membry School, and there's other courses going on there. Quite interesting stuff if you're interested. But let me know what you think about this topic. If you had any questions, or if you wanted to give me more information, I'd love to learn more about Sudan, and I'd love to learn more about the horses there and just horses in general. I love the comments that I've been getting on my videos, and I really appreciate the new subscribers. So thank you for sticking around, and have a good one. Peace.